There we go. You should have a thing to accept your participation in this recording.
So for the benefit of the recording, this is the third code along session in week 3. And we're going to be looking at some data on Paralympic athletes. We're also going to be looking at some other data. So I've got 2 different data frames, and what I want to do is join them together. So that we have, for each Paralympic athlete, they have a country that they represent, and I want to try and get some data about the countries into this data frame. And if we have time at the end, which I hope we will, we're going to look at how we might actually plotting some things with the sort of combined data. But the priority here is to actually get our data into a usable form. So I'm going to show you the data. I'll show you our nice file, but I need to share my screen for that. So give me 1 second, and I will do that. There's screen 2. Yeah, hopefully you can see that. I've already opened the package in RStudio. I'm not going to go through how you do that again. There are some instructions on the website. And this is our markdown file that we're going to be working with. So you'll notice that there's 2 main data frames here. There's the Paralympic data, which I'm just reading directly from the web. There's a data frame that I've downloaded because there wasn't a nice link for that, and I've included it. There's 2 other data frames as well. I'm not going to talk about what these are yet, because that's going to be relevant later. I needed to include them so you had everything you needed. When I started this, I didn't realize I was going to need those. So let's pretend those last 2 aren't there right now. There's also a typo, so I'll just put a space in there. The code will still run. It's better to, it just looks neater. So let's just knit this file and see what happens. And I forgot to change the options. So let's fix that. Click there, preview in viewer pane, and let's knit again. You can clone the R Markdown file. If you scroll, if you go onto the organization page, you'll find code along 03. And it's there. You can clone it and you can work on this as well along with this. So please do that if you'd like.
I've pinned it right to the top of the organization pins at the very top kind of panel. You see some squares, code along 3 is there. I'll also post it in the chat again as well.
So let's have a look at, let's run this code chunk and let's get our data in. So as I say, we're going to ignore, and we've got a problem. So a lot of people have had this problem. Where it's saying error and read CSV couldn't find function, and that's because, or similar problems to that, and that's because I didn't run this code chunk first. So the file knitted perfectly well, because when I knit it, it runs every bit of code, but as soon as it's knitted the document, it forgets anything that you've defined, it forgets anything that you've loaded. It doesn't sort of remember that outside of just producing this document. So we have to remember to run all the code directly ourselves. So let's run library tidyverse. That will get us our tidyverse functions ready to use, and then let's run that code chunk again. So as I say, we're going to ignore these 2 data frames for now, the top 2. And so let's have a look at the main data frame we're going to look at. So the Paralympics, as you may or may not be aware, are major international sport competition, multi-sport competition that run parallel to the Olympics. So they run a couple of weeks afterwards, usually. Most recent ones were this year in Tokyo. But the data frame doesn't actually contain any of the Tokyo data. It contains data from 1980. I can't remember where they were in 1980, through to 2016 when they were in Rio. So it contains data on what the event was, what the medals were, who the athletes were, and a little abbreviation for their country. There's also a country column, but often that hasn't been filled in. Sometimes it's been filled in. Sometimes it hasn't. And we're going to have to deal with that. The country names aren't there. We just have abbreviations. This is enough that we probably can't rely on it. So we've also got the sport, the year. The guide is that for certain sports, particularly for visually impaired athletes, they will have a guide who also gets a medal, a cited guide. And I assume that column is for saying that most of these athletes are not visually impaired, so they don't have a guide. And in fact, I'm struggling to find anyone who does, but let's sort this column then and see if anyone comes up. There we go. So as an example here, Jerome Avery was the guide for David Brown in this particular event, which was the 100 meters T11. T11 is the category of disability that corresponds to that event. So athletes are in different categories. So hopefully that's explained the data a little bit. So what we're now going to do is start to think about working with it. What I'd like to do is, so this data frame is pretty good as it is. As I say, there's a slight issue with the country column, but we're not too worried about that because we do have the country abbreviation, and that should be enough for us to work out which country they were. You're not able to access this table, someone says. So you should be able to get it by running the second code chunk in the file. So if you run the second one, it will load all of these data frames for you. If that doesn't work. So yeah, what I wanted to do is to get some basic demographic data about these countries in as well. So here is my other data frame, and they're not popping up. Could you have a chat about that in the chat? Yeah, thanks, David. So what I also wanted was some population data, and the best ones I could find, this isn't for every country in the world, this is for countries that are members of the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I've got the Wikipedia page ready here, because that might be useful, and it will have somewhere a list of member countries. So here are the member countries of the OECD. So there's a nice data website for these countries, and yeah, it's not every country. It may not include Costa Rica because they've only just joined. Colombia is relatively recent as well, so they may not be in the data set. It should include most of the others. Yeah, these are the countries that are in the OECD, and we're going to have some data on. So what have we got here? So if you look at the data dictionary for this, I'm not going to call it up, but I can explain what it does. So location is a 3-letter code for the country. So that's good because we have 3-letter codes for the countries here. So we should be able to hopefully join them with that. We've got indicator, which in every case is pop. So I can check that by doing, for instance, just in the console, OECD data, count indicator. Everything is pop. That's not really all that useful for us. It means these are population data. Okay, let's have a look at what the subject is doing. So the subject column is being as hot men and women. The OECD data do not recognize, as it stands, non-binary genders. This is a problem with a lot of data sets, that they will only show men and women as to genders or sexes, depending on how they've done it, or what the question was. So that's a thing just to bear in mind when you're looking at data.
So especially historical data as well, I should add, because
yeah.
we're going all the way back to the 1950s here. So, sometimes these data sets also don't update the way that they collect data, because then it changes the way that we can then run and get information on it.
Yeah.
But sometimes they do. And then in that case, you'll need to know when they've changed, and then account for the fact that now they've changed either the way they've asked the question or the way they're collecting the data. And so sometimes that makes it harder to compare pre-old, way that they were asking the question to the new way that they're asking the question as well. And something to look out for in all sorts of data sets as well, because that is one area where you're starting to see changes. And so that might be something you need to think about.
And questions aren't always asked very well in that respect as well. I've seen certain things that count transgender as like a separate category from male and female, which it's not. So, there's all sorts of things you just have to be aware of with this, both data collection problems and also just kind of sensitivity when you're sort of actually analyzing the data. A couple of, so actually as a separate point on the same thing of changing, one thing I had to check here was, said Germany is a member of the OECD. Actually, in 1961, Germany didn't exist as one country. It was West Germany that joined. And then what I was wondering was, well, these population data, they suddenly step up in 1990 to reflect the fact that West Germany became Germany. And so suddenly we'd have the population of then East Germany coming in. It turns out the answer is no. These data, even though they go back to the 1950s, are counting the whole of the population of Germany. That, in the one hand, is maybe more consistent. On the other hand, my Paralympic data, because they were separate countries, West Germany and East Germany were competing separately in the Paralympics into the 1980s. So we just don't have population data for those countries at the time because we only have it for the whole of Germany. So these other columns, just to go through them, so we have measure. So that's telling us that we have growth, which is annual growth in population, so that's going to be as a percentage. And we've got Mulm per, and when I looked at what that means, that is the population of that country expressed in millions. So, the population of Australia in 1983, the population of men in Australia in 1983 was not 7.686346. It was 7,686,346. The frequency variable, let's have a look at what that's doing. So that one is doing absolutely nothing for us today. That just says A for everything. So we're going to drop that probably because it's not useful. Time is the year. Value is the particular value in question of the thing that corresponds to all of these. And then flag codes, if we look at what that does, because of the space in that, it's annoying. I'm going to have to put these tick marks backwards. Flag codes are just NA all the way through. So that's not useful either. I think that's something to do with if you want to flag a particular country when you're downloading the data, you can do, but I didn't, so that's just NA. So there's quite a few columns we want to get rid of here. So these data are, firstly, one thing I'm going to notice here is we are going to want to produce a set of columns for each country, of each AB here. We want to produce a set of columns that provide us with the 4 different measures that we've got for each country and year, because we want to add those columns onto the end. So we're going to want to run the library code. You would just click on the little play button at the top right here, this right arrow. I'll just run that code. We're going to want to have 4 more. No problem. We're going to want to have 4 more columns for annual growth in total population, total male population, total female population, and total population. Currently these data are in a kind of long format. So I think you've seen this yet. Have you seen like long pivoting data frames? Yeah, I hope so. And someone want to put in the chat whether you've seen this?
I think that was this week.
Is that this week? Yes, excellent. So do we want to make this longer or wider? If we want 4 columns for 4 different values for each country. Wider. Oh, we've got a combination. We've got wider, longer. We've got 2 votes for wider, 1 vote for longer, 3 votes for wider. So I'll tell you, yes, it's wider. So the reason it's wider is currently this is in this sort of long format. For each of these things, each combination of country and year, we have 4 rows. We have one with pot A growth, one with pot Mulm per, one with men Mulm per, and one with women Mulm per. And what we want to get it to is those being in 4 separate columns. So yeah, we want that to be wider. We want to reduce the number of rows and increase the number of columns. So let's start doing that. So I'm going to add a new section here. I'm going to fill in the sort of text later, but I'll just put cleaning up data. I'll make this prettier later. So our cleanup, and what we want to do is take our OECD data, and the first thing I'm going to do you remember I said right at the beginning that it was annoying that I had to put these backticks in here because the variable name had a space in it. So I had to backticks in to let R know this was the variable name. So that's annoying. So what I want to do is clean up the names, and there's a handy function in a package called janitor that does that. I'll explain that in a sec to the person in the chat. So I'm going to try and call, okay, I'm trying to use the package janitor. It says there's no package. That's because it's not installed yet. So we didn't include this in the setup. We included tidyverse as pre-installed. We didn't include janitor. So if you want to install a package like that, you just in the console type install the packages and the name of the package in quotes. Thanks, someone answered the question there. And it'll take a little while, but it will eventually install the package for you. Give it a minute.
Do you maybe want to go over while we're waiting for it to install why we have those little messages next to R there again? I think we mentioned it last week, but it might be worth going over.
Those are little labels for the code chunks. So this is just so we can identify the chunk. You don't have to put a label in, but it's probably good practice to do so because it helps with sort of identifying the structure and if you need to refer in certain contexts to a code chunk. You don't have to label them, as I say. The only thing is that if you do label them, you should make sure every code chunk has a different label. If they have the same one, if two have the same, you'll get an error. And I'll demonstrate that actually now. So if I'll just make the actual code that will run. So let's say I do that, and then I just paste that again. So they're both called cleanup, and I try and knit it. It just immediately says duplicate chunk label cleanup, which has been used for the chunk OECD data. So I'll do that. Let's try and clean this up. So what we're going to want to do is then I've now loaded this, now installed this package janitor. I'm going to run this code chunk again so that we get our janitor package. And I am going to, yeah, you can, it won't update on its own. You can edit while watching. It definitely won't. Just someone asked if they should edit while watching or if it will update to reflect what I'm doing. It will not update to reflect what I'm doing. This isn't like Google Docs. If I pushed it and then you pulled, you would see my changes. But I'm not going to push it until the end of the session. So I might commit at various points midway through. Maybe, for instance, when I finish cleaning up the data. So OECD data, and I'm going to firstly run a particular function from janitor, which is called clean names. And if we look at what that does, that makes all of our names nice lowercase things in snake case. So with these underscores to separate separate words. So that's good. The next thing I'm going to do, I said that 3 of these columns weren't very useful. Does anyone remember which columns I said weren't useful? Anyone want to put in the chat any columns that were not useful because they were just the same all the way down? Anyone remember? Flag codes is one of them. Yeah.
Maybe you can scroll up through your console as well and see if we can see it in the console.
So yeah, indicator, someone said in the chat, was one of them. Country name, I did say wasn't useful. I'll leave that in for now because it has some information. It's not completely useless. We're not going to be able to rely on it, but it's if we're just trying to clean up this data frame on its own, it has some useful data. Frequency, someone said. Let's have a look. Yeah, frequency was also not useful. I think there were just 3 of them. So we're just going to do that. So if we do that now, we've just got these 5 columns. Oh, the other thing is population was in the, sorry, country name within the other data frame. So we can't do anything with that yet. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to want to do is, I said that I wanted to pivot this wider. So I actually want to pivot it by 2 columns, and you can do that. So pivot wider is the function we want. And the main options in this are names from and names, and values from. So which column, when we make these new columns, where are the values in those columns going to come from, and where are the names of those columns going to come from? So does anyone know what I should put in? Let's do the easier one. Where's the values from going to come from? What do I need to put here? So which column of our existing, the one you can see at the bottom of my screen here, I'm going to make the font size bigger as well.
The clue is in the name.
The clue is in the name, yeah. Value, yeah, value. If you ran it and you don't have time or value, I don't know what's happened. It might be they've just fallen off the end of the screen, that it might say like 2 missing columns. So yeah, the value is value.
Can you explain why? That might not be obvious.
So the values from column might not always be called value, but essentially what we're trying to do is we want this column to be just our data, like the numerical data that we want to end up in these columns. And this is the column that contains that. So when we're interested in like we want to split this column, the data in this column, across the 4 different columns, because this is the total A growth for Australia, but somewhere else it might be men, the population. Someone says, what does the C do? So what the C does is the C creates a vector of these columns. It says like sort of bind these columns into these column names into a vector. And the minus says, okay, now move all of them. So if I didn't put the C brackets in, it would say, don't select flag codes, but do select indicator and frequency. And actually, I think that would give an error. Because I won't go back and do it. It would mean undoing too much what I've done, but I think that would give an error because it doesn't know what to do with don't select these columns, but do select these ones. And then thinks, well, hang on, what about the ones you haven't told me about? So the names from here is a little bit more confusing, a little bit more complicated, because we've actually got 2 columns that we want to combine into our variable names, which are the subject and the measure. And it turns out actually that C was very relevant here. We want to use both of these columns to combine to make the names, and the tidyverse can deal with that really straightforwardly. You just put in the names of the 2 columns. I'm going to do them the other way around. It makes slightly more sense because that determines what it will do is it will run those column names together as the name of the column. So run those values together. So what we want to happen is we want a column for annual growth total, for instance. So let's see what happens when we do this. Okay, well, that's something. But all of that work we did, all of that good work we did earlier when we were cleaning up our column names has all gone to waste now, because now we have some columns in massive text. So we could clean names again if we want. The other thing we could do is just clean our data back at this step. So just change that column to be in lowercase. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to choose that option. So what I'm going to do is firstly, I'm just going to insert another step here, mutate measure equals and the function is to lower. So I want to change the content of that to lowercase. I'll run this afterwards so you can see what it did. So subject equals to lower subject. If we run that, so you notice there's no pipe here. There's no pipe yet here. So it's just the pipeline has stopped here. And what it's done is it's changed these columns to lowercase, which means that when we add that back into the pipeline, now it's looking better. Now our columns are all nice. So can we use cbind and rbind function to merge rows and columns? You can. I don't think they're not going to work nicely with pipelines because they're not tidy functions. Yeah.
I was just answering. Yeah, so cbind and rbind for data.frames primarily and base R, whereas obviously we're using a lot of stuff for the tidyverse.
Yeah.
So sometimes it probably will work, but it won't work as nicely as the functions that are designed to work well with Tibbles inside the tidyverse.
So actually so that was one thing I could do, and these column names still aren't very informative. I don't really know what these mean. Mulm per tot isn't helpful. So actually, I'm going to not do this step. I'm going to comment that out. So that just skips it from the pipeline. And I'm instead, so now what's going to happen, we're back to what we had before. And I'm just going to manually rename these columns. So I'm going to use rename. And I'm going to say that I want a new column called, so in this, when you're using the rename, the first bit is what you want the name to be. And the second bit is the existing function, existing column. So we've got A growth tot is just going to be called annual growth. Pop men is going to be mulm per men. So I should, strictly speaking, if we're being nice and pleasant with our function here. It should load that. Pop women is going to be mulm per women, and pop total is going to be mulm per top. So if we now run that, there we go, that's all informative. Is indentation necessary in R? Someone asked in the chat. No, but so in Python, it absolutely matters, and that's a design choice in Python to force you to write your code in a readable way. R doesn't do that. It's sort of before anyone came up with that idea, and the tidyverse doesn't try and, I don't even know if it could try and do that if it wanted to, because the basic thing of R is that it ignores indentation. But it's very good practice to do the indentation because it just makes your code more readable. The first bit is the new name, yeah. So in rename, the first bit here is the new name. So we're saying we want a new column called annual growth. So it's a bit like when you're using a mutate. The first column, the first thing is the new name, and the second thing is the old name. So actually, this is very much, rename is very much like a mutate statement, except in fact, if I did this as mutate, let's just show you what happens if I change this to a mutate instead of a rename. What happens is it just makes new columns with those names. So that will be fine, and we could then remove them, but rename lets us skip a step. It lets us just go, okay, we just want new names for these things. Should we not set the code chunk equal to a new variable right at the start? We should, yes. But I don't want to say, if I did that, then I wouldn't be able to see what my code was doing. So what I'm doing at the moment is just coding everything so it prints the outcome at the end. And once I'm done, once I'm happy with what I've got, I'm then going to go back and save this under a name. Someone asked what the hash does. That comments out the line. So what that does is it means that line, it's still in the code, but I just ignores it. So because I've commented out the whole line, just skips that line. And the way we write pipelines works quite nicely with that, because what I've done, I've skipped out one statement and one pipe operator, so it just moves on to the next one. And I can explain pivot wider again. So if I just break the pipeline there by putting a hash there, so now it's going to ignore that pipe. What we see is that we have our subject to measure here and a value column. If we compare to what we get, and I break the pipeline here, so just so you can see the effect of the pivot wider, what's happened is these two columns, so top and A growth, it's combined the names of them into a column header, and then it's put these values, 2.97, 2.55, and so on, it's put them actually in the column. If we looked further down on this original thing, we'd have a column eventually that said men mulm per, and some more values, and it's put them as there. Make sense? I'll move on. Feel free to ask if you want, or David can clarify more in the chat if you want.
You tend to get to them before I get a chance to write out my answer, but yes, you're very quick.
So these data are now looking pretty good. So I'm going to try and join them to the other data now. So here we go. So our join, I'm going to call this code chunk. So I want to start with my other data frame, because that's the main one I want, is the Paralympic data. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a oh, and I should save these clean data as well now. Thank you for the person who said that in the chat. So I'm going to call this OECD clean. So we've now got a new data frame in our environment, which is this one with all of our nice column headers and stuff. So we're going to start with our Paralympic data. We need to add a, someone asked, why do we need to add a C before measure and subject? The reason is that if I don't put the C, you see what happens. This thinks that my what I'm doing is names from is measure. Then it's got an argument called subject, and it doesn't know what to do with that because the commas here separate arguments of the pivot wider function. So what the C does, it's the thing we use to make vectors, but we're using it here essentially to group these two things together and say these together are the argument to names from. If we didn't know what the variables meant, would you be able to find out which variable means? You can't use the question mark OECD data because I just loaded it. The answer to how you find out what they mean, actually the OECD ones, and the reason I've explained it is The reason I've explained it just verbally is the OECD data dictionary is not very good, and I had to like try and work it out myself. But you would go back to the original source. Someone asked why we can't just put the brackets, and that's a good question. Let's see what happens if we don't, if we just do that. Expected comma. So yeah, the brackets in R don't really do very much other than group certain things together. We need the C to tell it actually this is a kind of, C is a grouping function. Essentially in this case, we need a function to apply to group these things together. R just kind of ignores the brackets a little bit. So that's why. Okay, so we're going to try and join our data together. So what I would like is I'd like to, okay, firstly, we did say we maybe didn't want the country, so I'm going to get rid of that one. That was the one that was incomplete. Oh, good question again. What's the difference between mutate and pivot wider? So mutate will always preserve the number of rows of our data. So a mutate statement will do some function of a column and make a new column, but it doesn't change the number of rows. It just creates a new column with the same observations. In pivot wider, remember rows are observations, columns are variables. In pivot wider, we're sort of changing the meaning of what we call a single observation. So we're saying that actually each row is now going to have, instead of each row being one observation, each row is always going to be one observation, but we're combining 4 observations, so the ones for growth and the 3 populations. We're saying actually that's now 1 observation of 4 variables instead of 4 observations, which are vary in what they're measuring. So the answer is, if you want to, and just someone's still confused about the pipe at the end of every line. So what the pipe is doing is, it is, so yeah, the pipe is a strange thing in R, so I'm going to explain this again. So what this is, I'll show you, I'll just take these top 2 lines, I'll just break this pipeline here, and just move down from there. So it's the beginning of a pipeline. So we could write this as, so what this, let's take this to this. So let's see what, I'm going to make a new code chunk. I don't want to break what I've done there. So R pipe, let's call it. Okay, so let's just copy the first couple of things from here. So OECD pipe clean. So what that's going to do, oops, as we know, that cleans the names. So that's equivalent to, I'll write a statement down here, that's equivalent to clean names OECD data. Those two do exactly the same thing. To the error in the chat, I think you've used a hyphen instead of an underscore for the view statement when you've tried to view it. So those two things do the same thing. So now let's look at the next bit of the pipeline. So, okay, so just again to explain what's happened here, all this pipe has done is it's taken OECD data and put it inside this clean name. So these 2 bits of code do exactly the same thing. Okay, so the next bit of the pipeline was this select statement. So let's take that, add that on to the end of our pipeline. Okay, so that's equivalent now to taking the result of these 2 bits and putting it in at the beginning of the select statement. So this is the same as select clean names OECD data. So these 2 bits of code do the same thing. Let's find out. So that is the same as that. So every time the pipe is just taking what's before it and putting it as the first argument of the select function. The reason we're using it is this is already getting quite hard to read. What's going on here is really hard to determine. And then when we add all these other things, it's going to get ridiculous. So there are ways around this without using the pipe, which are usually to use sort of placeholder variables. So what you could do is say something like temporary is clean names OECD data, and then overwrite that. Temp is select temp minus C flag. So we're each time just creating a new thing that's temporary. Now, some people prefer this way of doing it, I'm going to say. But for what it's worth, I don't. It also causes problems with if I want to kind of preview my code as I'm going along. So for me, I don't like this way of working. Some people prefer it. But, encouraging you in this course to use the pipe thing, to use the pipe because it's just a lot more readable. So you can work in R without pipes, but they make your code more readable. Point. So we'll go back to our joining of our data. So we've removed the country column. So what it's going to look like is that. And now what we want to do is we want to add on some new columns so that when we find each country abbreviation, it looks at the OECD data and it adds these columns on for this country and year. So that's going to be one of our join functions. Yeah, that's right. So Paralympic data is going inside the select function, sort of we're selecting, we're deselecting the column country from Paralympic data. So what kind of join do we want here if we want to include every row from Paralympic data, even if we can't find a match in the OECD data? So not every country that's won a medal in the Paralympics is a member of the OECD. And what we're going to do, yes, very good, left join. So we're going to left join, and we want to left join OECD cleaned, and we want to do it by, so we want to do it by 2 columns. So the problem is these columns have different names in the 2. So AB here, let's join it by AB, which is the country abbreviation. And in our OECD clean, that's called location. So we want to do C, and we write it like this. So we write location equals AB. No, it's the other way around, I think. Yeah, other way around, because we want the one from this data frame first. So AB equals location, and we want to do it by year. That's actually called time in the other one. So we want to join it by 2 columns. We wanted to look up in our OECD data that abbreviation and that year and find these 4 values. So let's try and see what happens. That's looking pretty good. But there's immediately a problem. So Den, I'm going to give you a clue here. Den stands for Denmark. So Denmark won the gold in this event in 1980, the archery. Why isn't location equals AB? It's because, so we have to put the quotes in, that's just part of the syntax of this function, just how it works. It's a little bit annoying. So the reason it's that way around is the first one is the one from sort of the data frame that we started our pipeline with. The second one is the name from this other data frame. Someone says blurry, that's going to be a signal problem. It should hopefully resolve fairly soon. Yeah, let's answer the other question. So the problem we notice here is that Denmark doesn't have any annual growth population, anything like that. If we look at the OECD, Denmark is definitely a member of the OECD. So something's gone wrong. So what's the problem here? Can anyone guess? The error could be there's an underscore missing, maybe. Can anyone tell me what might be the problem here? Why is Denmark not working? Why is this? Yes, someone says it's got a different code or something. I didn't interpret what that meant. Yeah, so this is where things get annoying, and this is where these other 2 tables come in. So it turns out the International Olympic Committee, which also defines the codes for the International Paralympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee uses one set of 3-letter codes, and here are the codes. And if we look down there, there is Denmark and it's Den. OECD is using ISO codes. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. And the code for Denmark there is DNK. So that's why this isn't working. So what we're going to have to do here, Well, I think what we're going to have to do is join by country name, because we can't use these codes. So what we're going to do with the OECD data is we're going to firstly, okay, so we know not every country is in the OECD. Oh, I've got a missing pipe operator because I commented it out. Not every country is in the OECD, so we only want a left join here again. And we're going to use our ISO lookup. And what we want is that what in our OECD data is called location, we want to join to we want to join to the ISO code in the ISO data. So let's do that. And actually, let's just get rid of the assignment at the beginning so we can see what happened. So left join keeps everything from the data frame that our pipeline starts. And if something's in this data frame, it will get a row in the new data frame. If it's in this one, but not in this one, it won't. So it keeps things from OECD data and doesn't necessarily keep things from ISO lookup. So we've now got our country names added. So that's looking good. And we want to, so let's save that again under OECD cleaned. And down here, we're going to want to do exactly the same thing with our Paralympic data. So what was it called? The so we're going to, before we join the OECD cleaned, we're going to want to do a left join of our country names from the IOC lookup. So IOC lookup, and we want to join by, so our AB column is going to correspond to the country column in this. No, it's not. Our AB column is going to correspond to the IOC code column in this. Okay, so we've now got a, we've removed our old country column and added a new one, which has our country names added in. Okay, so now let's try joining them. So actually we can ignore these abbreviations. We can just say we want country to match with country, so that's straightforward, and we still want to match with year. So let's try and join these two things. So again, left join is that it's keeping everything from one data frame, from the data frame that starts the pipeline, not including the things necessarily that are in the other one. So if you have a look at one of the videos as well, it talks about the different join functions. There's like an inner join and a whatever. I'm going to use an inner join in a minute, actually, because this is looking quite good. But if this row here is looking a bit dodgy. I'll tell you why, because I recognize that great, and there's only one country I know that starts with great in the Paralympics, and it's Great Britain. So I'm just going to, out of interest, just check that. I'm going to select country and annual growth, just so I can see those columns more clearly. And yeah, Great Britain is showing NA. Now, I know that Great Britain is in the OECD as well, except this is the problem. In the Olympics and the Paralympics, for some reason, the United Kingdom is known as Great Britain. It's for some historical reason that has kind of lost to the mist of time, but they're sticking with it. So although the United Kingdom is made up of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in the Olympics and Paralympics, we go by the name Great Britain as a country. In the OECD, they're actually using the full title. So from our data that we had here, from our ISO lookup, it's actually put it as United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's our full name. So we are going to need to modify some of our country names. So I'll do that in a sec. I'll just answer a couple of questions first. So what is the minus? Do you mean the minus or the underscore? So the underscore is just, oh, you mean the minus here. So that is saying we don't want the country column. So we've removed the old country column and eventually added a new one here. Someone else, can we use filter instead of select? No. Filter is used for filtering rows, so selecting certain rows. Select is used for selecting certain columns. So yeah, let's get rid of that. We didn't actually want to just restrict to those columns. What we're going to need to do is filter some of our names. So let's have a look then. Let's do an inner join here instead. So we only get the countries that are in the OECD included. And I'm now going to count countries. So get the country names of the countries that appear. So that's going to what's that doing? Yep, that's produce a thing, and we're going to print the whole thing. Let's just say 100 for sake. So these are the countries that it thinks are in the OECD that won Paralympic medals. But as you notice, UK is missing, the US is missing. So let's have a think about what we could do with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say country names, just eliminating it from the it doesn't remove it from the original data frame because we haven't assigned it anywhere, but it means we don't want it going further in this pipeline. It removes it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing for our OECD countries. So OECD table. Let's see. So I want OECD table to be OECD cleaned, and I want to count again country. I could use unique country. All I'm essentially wanting is a list of the country names. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to say what I want to do is leave that Paralympic data as it is, just up here. Actually, no, I'm going to leave that there. So I'm going to say Paralympic, let's say Paralympic partial is that. Paralympic, yeah, that'll do. Paralympic OECD, let's say. So what I'm now going to do, include that there. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to say that what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a look. So what I'm trying to do is just get a list of the countries that are in Paralympic table is Paralympic OECD count country. We've got two tables of these countries, and what I'm now going to do is I'm going to say fine, Paralympic table. I'm going to take that, and what I'm going to do, no, other way around. I want to know which OECD countries are not showing up in the Paralympic table. That's the question I want to answer. So I want to see which OECD countries are not showing up. Because it may be they just didn't win any Paralympic medals, but it may be that their names are different. So those are the ones that we're going to need to manually check. So what we want to do is OECD table, and we want an outer join with Paralympic table. I think that's the one we want. Can't find outer join. No, there's a name for it, and I can't remember what it is. Oh, I know how to do it. Fine, never mind. So OECD table, let's going to do a full join, I think it is. It's full join the function. I'll explain what that. So the arrow, the little arrow thing, it means that I want to take the outcome of this pipeline and I want to save it under the name Paralympic table. So it's sort of storing something under this name. So full join. So I'm going to join these two together. I'm going to use a full join. Does anyone remember what a full join does? I hope I'm using the right function name here. Yeah. Let's hide that. Anyone remember what a full join does? If OECD isn't found, it means you possibly not assigned it at the top here. So what a full join does, I'm going to say because we're a bit short of time, is that it joins everything together, no matter which. It joins everything together, no matter whether they exist in one or the other. So make sure they're both included. And what I want to do is then I want to look at the countries that appear in. That's annoying. So what's happened now is we've got two n columns because both of our tables are n's. So I'm going to rename n.para equals n. Again. Not oh, right. So N is the number of times each country appeared in the OECD table, N.para is the number of times each country appeared in the Paralympic table. And what we want to know is which countries are giving an NA in the N.para table. So which OECD countries did not win? So filter is.NA, N.para. There we go. These are the countries that are not showing up in our Paralympic table. So these are the ones where we need to look up whether the names are different. So if that was a little bit confusing, what I've done there, apologies. It might be worth going and having a look back at what I've done. Essentially, that was a little bit of code where what I'm trying to do is essentially debugging code. I'm trying to get a list of which countries do I need to check where the names might be different. So let's have a look at these. So Costa Rica, in the IOC table, Costa Rica is just called Costa Rica, so they must not have won any Paralympic medals. The point of the rename code here was that it was to make sure, so I could distinguish between these two N columns, because when we counted the entries in both tables, I could have called this one N.OECD if I'd not been lazy. I was getting N.X and N.Y. It was just automatically renaming them to different things, and it was just to make sure that I knew this was the number of times these countries showed up in the Paralympic table. This was the number of times they showed up in there. So Costa Rica just didn't win any medals, but Czechia in the IOC table is going to be called Czechia. It's called Czech Republic. So the Czech Republic renamed themselves to Czechia in English, but the IOC hasn't caught up yet. So this is starting to give us an idea for what we need our countries to be. So I'm going to use the Paralympic names because these are really Paralympic data. So I probably don't have time to do this, but I'm going to tell you what the next step would be, and I'll put it in the code. So what I'm going to do is rename these countries back in our original OECD data to use the same names. So this is the kind of manual cleanup that sometimes you just have to do, and we're at that point now where we just have to do this. So we've used the code to be able to find out, we don't have to check everything now. We only need to check the ones that aren't showing up. And what we need to do is use this to tell whether or not these countries just didn't win the Paralympic medals, and that's why they're not appearing, or whether they're appearing but under a different name. So Czechia is Czech Republic. Korea Republic of, if we look here, is going to appear in the IOC table, probably under the name South Korea, I think. Might appear as, let's have a look. No, those are some former countries that pop up at the end. Let's see, there it is, South Korea. So that's another one. Malta in the IOC is called Malta, so they just haven't won any Paralympic medals. They're quite small, so that's not surprising. Romania is just called Romania, so they just haven't won any medals. Russian Federation is coming up as Russia, so that needs fixing. United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland is coming up. We've already talked about this one as Great Britain. And United States of America is coming up as United States. There is also North Korea. North Korea isn't in the OECD, so that's why that's not appearing. So remember, these were the only countries that are showing up here are countries that have different names in the OECD and in the IOC data. So what we could have done for a full lookup, if we wanted to, I could have made one big lookup table, and maybe I'll do that. Maybe that's the way I'll present this later. Make one big lookup table for this whole thing that actually clean the data and combine these country names together. Because sometimes there is sometimes there's a mismatch for other countries that aren't in the OECD. So yeah, in the ISO, North Korea is appearing as Korea Democratic People's Republic of, and in the IOC, I'm going to guess that that's appearing as North Korea. Probably under. can't find it because it's not going to appear under N because I'll sort by country name that. Could have done that earlier, but yeah, so it's appearing as North Korea and PRK is its IOC code. So actually that's one case where the codes would have helped us because they do match, but the names don't. What else? There'll be several other countries where that's happening. I suspect Laos is another one. Laos there, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, and Laos, Democratic Republic, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because we're out of time. I'm going to clean, as usual, I'm going to clean this code up, and I'm going to I am going to give you a someone says for the lab, it's technically submitted when you push your last change. That's correct, yeah. Someone asked, have the repositories for Homework 1 and Labo 2 been made? Yes. David, yeah?
Half yes.
Half yes.
In the Homework 1 is made. I'm making Lab 02 later today. I wanted to make sure that this whole problem was sorted first and that everyone was in teams. Most of you are now in teams. Yep. I think there's one or two people that still I need to talk with. But yeah, I've just been kind of waiting again on Lab 2 just to make sure that everyone's in teams, so I don't need to then shuffle people around again. It's a little bit quicker if people are already in teams when I make the labs. So yeah, I'll make that later today. But the Homework 1, you should have one. If you don't have one, Ela, message me and I'll see why. We should probably stop recording as well.
Can we just also clarify when the deadline is for the lab just before we stop recording?
Yep, I'm going to leave that as 4 o'clock today because okay, it's working now. Yeah. So
the lab needs to be submitted by 4 o'clock today. Are you allowed to install new packages in addition to us providing the homework? Shouldn't need to.
I guess you can if you want, but you shouldn't need to because yeah, you're kind of meant to. So I guess the answer is yes, you can install new packages. I'm not going to limit you on that. You can try address the homework in any way. When we get to marking them, it may be that who does the marking might feel that you've done it in an overly complex way, and they might give you some code to say you did it that way, but this is a way that maybe might have been a little bit easier to achieve the same thing. So yeah, I guess we'll do it that way.
And someone quickly asked, do we need to generate a token to work on a blank code page for practice? No, you don't. The token is so you can push to GitHub. So if you're not pushing to GitHub, you... And to answer the thing, Lab 01 was due on Tuesday. We extended it because there have been persistent problems with RStudio. So if you submit it by Tuesday, well done. But several people got caught up in problems with RStudio that started like a couple of hours before the deadline.
And just to clarify again, please check my announcements that I make. There's a link on the website to the announcements. They're on Learn. You also get emailed them as well. If you are not receiving my email announcements, can you message me and CC in the call secretary, and we'll double check that your email address is correct in the Learn database, I guess, because you should be receiving those, and they're normally quite important for keeping up to date.
Do you want to stop recording now, actually?
Yeah, let's do that.
There's a few more questions which I'll answer, but we are